Chapter 5 Assault. We entered the outpost slowly, playing up our false damage as much as possible. From my position on the back of the wagon, I could see that several of the soldiers had adopted fake limps or dragging legs, and more than one was clutching an arm as if it had been wounded. I grinned at them, then pulled a blanket over myself, Lek, and Ryota. Ryota was a risk even here. We had tested to see if her hair would ignite things, and had gotten inconsistent results. Worst case scenario, we supposed, things would just have to start up a bit early. The gates were honestly impressive. These outposts were on the very edge of the Shattered Kingdoms, and while caravans like our own regularly brought supplies and new troops, I had honestly assumed that they would be small and poorly maintained. While the main tower was the most imposing part of the outpost by far, up close the walls, gates, and what little else I could see from under the blanket as we passed were similarly well maintained, and much more solidly built than I had hoped. I tried to convince myself that it would be fine. Even with a bigger, better outpost than I had planned for, we had a solid way in and a good plan. It would rely fairly strongly on soldiers who had relatively newly joined our number, several of whom had already left, but, well, we couldn't fail. Neleus wouldn't let that happen. The wagons came to a halt. Neleus, standing ahead of the wagons somewhere, began to loudly argue with someone. I grinned softly. He was intentionally projecting his voice so that we would all hear. The argument was simple, really. He was demanding that he be allowed to see Knight Commander Venus, the military head of the outpost, immediately, and that his wagons and soldiers be escorted to the barracks while he did. Whoever he was arguing with was not quite so considerate to spies hiding beneath blankets, and I could not make out their side of things. Eventually, we began to move again. Neleus's voice passed by the wagons as we did. We were turning past him. It had worked. Again. A manic grin flitted across my face, although it disappeared as quickly as it had come. We would need to be ready, and that meant keeping composed. I looked between Lek and Ryota. Both had their hands on their weapons, and Ryota gave me a thumbs up, ash-black thumb wiggling a bit under the blanket's dark, just to be sure I could see it. I slid my dagger from its sheath softly and clutched it in both hands. Neleus's signal likely wouldn't come immediately, but it was supposed to come quickly. If it didn't, we were supposed to start anyways, 10 minutes after we reached the barracks. Garivor skipped ahead of the pack of soldiers and to the back of our wagon, and hopped aboard, making a show of looking for something in a chest beside us. Venus was right there. This might get messy. Stay ready, he whispered softly before hopping back off the cart, a piece of jerky in hand. Not a trace of a joke in his voice. Venus must have shown some sign of hostility or suspicion. The sound of wheels on earth slowly morphed into the sound of wheels on cobblestone, sharp and regular with each small movement of the wagons. The barracks must be near. No border outpost like this would waste pavement on anything less important, especially outside the area in which carts are expected to travel. I breathed in softly, gathering myself and doing what I could to calm my mind and keep still. It was unlikely, at least from what we knew, that there would be another check at the barracks, but if there were, a moving blanket would certainly be suspicious. No check came. As expected, but I let loose a sigh of relief anyways, quietly lest some soldier be near. While people riding in the cart wouldn't be innately suspicious, should those people obviously not be soldiers, and, of course, hidden under blankets, that certainly would. The wagons came to a halt, the sound of the wheels on cobbles slowing and finally stopping beneath us. Garivor's voice came from ahead, casually talking with some guard. Garivor always did step in wherever Neleus wasn't available. He didn't really have the same natural talent for manipulation, but his amiable attitude and penchant for jokes made it relatively easy for him to endear himself, for the most part. Every so often someone would take issue with his lack of formality or a joke he told at the wrong time, but in general, few would challenge someone who had a talent for seeming like he had been your friend for years. In short order, we lurched back into motion, although only for a brief moment before coming to rest again. From underneath the blanket I could see that we had entered a storehouse of some kind, with several other wagons gathered on one side of the room. Only a minute or two passed before I could see that the soldiers had broken off to play their parts. Another moment or two and a tap on the wall of the wagon told us that we were alone. I burst from under the blanket, gulping in fresh air gratefully. There had been a crack through which to ensure our air didn't get too stale, and through which we peered at the outside world, but even with that in place it quickly became stuffy, as any child who has hidden their head under the covers at night will tell you. Shortly behind me came Ryota, who moved far more languidly as she stretched herself out from the cart. Her hair laid flat over and behind her head, pressed into place by the blanket we had been over. It flickered softly and then erupted back into its full, fiery glory in the open-aired space. Lek moved slower. Small, firm steps brought him to the edge of the wagon, and in what passed for showmanship with him, he stepped off the edge, falling solidly onto the balls of his feet. He moved his crossbow off his back and under his arm on its leather strap, and strode to the opening in the storehouse, where great, heavy wooden doors stood open. Lek glanced left, right, and then up from around the doors, careful not to be seen, then came back to us. Our soldiers are beginning to infiltrate. We need to do the same. His voice, soft as ever, was turned towards Ryota and I specifically. Take care not to be seen. We cannot pass for belonging. A small, barely present nod marked the end of his thought, and Lek turned on his heel and walked away, clutching his crossbow at the ready just in case. Ryota and I exchanged glances. Garivor, resting his weight against the side of the wagon, shook his head, grinning. Well, Lek's off. Metka's with the soldiers, playing up the Blade Master thing again. What do you think? Prisoner's gambit? I let out a groan and fell into a wide-legged crouch, draping my arms over my knees. Do you even have cuffs? Garivor slid 2 pairs of the metal rings from under his armor somewhere, his easy grin turning sly. Always, little lady. I groaned louder, then glanced towards the open doors and lowered my voice. I hate the splintering prisoner's gambit. There's got to be something else. Ryota rolled her eyes, the fire within flickering mesmerizingly within the movement. Better than trying to blacken my hair with it. She glanced upwards, dark fingers following her eyes in an indicative gesture. Well, you know, like this. I glared at her, standing straight up again on one foot, while kicking at a bit of stone with the other. I'm not giving up my knife. Garivor looked at me with consideration, golden eyes shimmering in the reflected light of Ryota's hair. Do you think you could stay out of sight? Could have you follow in the shadows if you can hack it. I groaned yet again, letting my head fall back in petulant false distress. Can't we just, I don't know, kill them all? It would be easier than this nonsense. Ryota snorted, shaking her head. Even with Neleus and I, we wouldn't get through half the outpost before we were cut down, Ken. Prisoner or sneak, which are you going for? Her voice echoed oddly, as if the spirit she was bound to spoke with a slight delay. While I considered her question, she offered her wrists to Garivor, who clasped one of the sets of cuffs around them. With an overperformed pout, I held up 2 fingers. Sneak, I guess. Rather that than have my knife taken. Garivor and Ryota nodded, and Garivor straightened, adopting the ramrod stiff posture of a lifetime crowned soldier, spear balanced in the crook of one arm and the other on Ryota's shoulder. As they began to walk away, he tilted his head back over one shoulder. Careful, kid. Follow quick-like, but slip out careful. I nodded and fell into a few quick stretches, putting one leg out and then the other, then pressing my hands together behind my back, bending down and pushing my arms upwards to test the full range of movement of my shoulders. I stood back into a natural stance, hands held slightly apart from my sides, and readied myself. My breath slowed, and my eyes drifted closed. When I opened them again, all was silver. My feet pounded against the ground, my body tilting forward instinctively as I ran. At the doorway I leapt, hand clutching onto the massive door for a moment before my feet found purchase on the lock bar and propelled me upwards. I slipped from the top of the door onto the sloped roof, staring out over the courtyard and taking in the silver-slowed scene with a soft breath. Falling to a crouch, I let the silver world fade, my eyes falling downwards to track Garivor and Ryota. Garivor was stopped for a moment by some guard, and made a loud show of having captured a sorcerer who had snuck into the outpost, gesturing with his spear in a fashion that could have been taken as threatening if it weren't so outlandishly broad. The guard let him pass after only a few quick sentences, and Garivor continued, striding cockily towards the watchtower's base with Ryota ahead. I flitted from rooftop to rooftop, bounding on all fours both to keep my profile low and to ensure that each leap would catch its target more naturally. Finally, Garivor and Ryota passed the door of the tower. Just as I was about to dart through one of the tower's upper windows, a high, piercing whine filled the air. Neleus's signal. Shaking the whine out of my ears, I leapt through the window, landing behind the single-posted soldier softly, on all fours. Below, I heard Garivor and Ryota break from the act, and felt an intense heat begin to build. The soldier turned, brow furrowed, already stepping towards the stairs, only to find me, flowing to my feet with blade outstretched. "Don't try it, man. We don't want to kill you." His hands went upwards, and I nodded my approval before bringing the hilt of my knife down towards his temple, knocking him out with a single firm blow. The others would have the lower levels covered. I needed to move upwards. The watch captain was meant to be on one of the top 2 floors at all times, according to the others we had recovered, and while the officer types were prone to disregarding their intended positioning, it was, at the least, something to go on. Floor by floor, I incapacitated as many of the soldiers as I could, although I had to slit the throats of 1 or 2 who refused to surrender. Finally, I reached a floor which had proper furnishings and a painting on one wall. Clearly the space in which an officer might spend their time. A large man in gilded steel armor, warped into bizarre bulbous shapes which made him look more ridiculous than imposing. I still don't understand the fashion in which nobility makes their armor, was standing in front of a window, mouth agape at the courtyard below. A massive sword, a ridiculous slab of iron which I had no doubt would split its target in half if he could even swing the thing, rested on his back, held in place by what looked like belts. As I came up behind him, I heard something shift and whirled. Emerging from the shadows of the room was a man with dark hair and bright, wicked eyes, a curling grin on his face, and a sword outstretched. Rakor. Behind me, the watch captain had turned towards me as well, and his nonsensical sword was suddenly in his hands, rather than resting on his back. I raised my own hands. Rakor's sword flickered out and knocked my knife loose, sending it clattering away over the floorboards. My eyes tracked it automatically before snapping back to Rakor's face. "No point in this, Rakor. A few minutes and the others will be up here. Killing me won't change anything." It was partly true, although in all likelihood it would take a bit longer than that. The lower levels of these outpost towers were usually where the jails were, and clearing those out would take some time. Any stalling I could get done would be good, though. My little maneuver in the Silver World had probably been a mistake. If I could slip into it right now, this would almost certainly be easy to deal with. Rakor glanced behind me to the watch captain, and that massive slab of a blade was suddenly hovering over my shoulder. Splinters. If he could hold it like that, he could definitely swing it. Rakor dropped the point of his own blade towards the ground, letting it dangle loosely from his hand as he began to pace in front of me. "Honestly, child, I didn't think it would be this easy to deal with you. Do you never check the room? Absolutely miserable banditry." A smirk slipped onto his face. This wouldn't do. I dropped and rolled towards my knife, hoping the watch captain would be too slow with that blade to catch me as I did. Just as I latched onto it, the flat of the watch captain's blade caught me, enough force behind the blow to send me flying. My vision went dark for a moment as I flew, and when it returned I found myself halfway out one of the tower's windows. I scrabbled desperately for the edge, hoping to grab it, but I was moving far too fast. And then I hit the ground. When I came to, Everything hurt. My legs and ribs alike felt as if they were cracked. I was fairly sure a stabbing sensation in my side was, in fact, my knife, caught between me and the cobblestone. My head was pounding, a roar of false sound ripping through my mind back and forth, and then it gave way. Behind the curtain of false noise was the realer sort. The sound of soldiers clashing filled the air. Steel on steel, iron on iron, and distantly, as I tried fruitlessly to push myself to my feet, a muffled explosion. I hoped that it was Neleus's magic, but feared that it might be a cannon, or worse, an enemy mage. I couldn't move enough to get up. At the very least, I managed to pull my knife out from under me before collapsing into a heap again. Through a haze, I saw a small, silver creature trot past a pair of fiercely dueling soldiers and approach me. Though my bleary vision kept it indistinct, I knew instinctively it was the fox, and weakly waved it away. This was no place for such a creature. Of course, I had no place to speak on the matter, being a child, but the irony did not occur to me at the time. The fox came to my side despite my protests, weak as they were through my injuries, and stared down at me, head cocked to one side. The sound of heavy, steel-clad footsteps on the cobble approached, and I looked in their direction, simultaneously terrified and hopeful. My hope faded as my pain-addled senses managed to work out that the approaching footsteps belonged to Rakor. My head fell back against the stone, neck unable to support me, craning it upwards to look. Rakor leveled his blade down at me, and the fox, precious creature it was, interposed itself between us, a low growl just barely making it through to my ears. And then darkness took me again.